So it's a delight to start off another round of research presentations this morning. I'm Charles Stewart from MIT for people who don't know me. I am assuming that everyone can read the bios that have been distributed. So we're not going to read bios for the presenters today. We will just jump in and we will start with Chris Lucas from WashU.
Morning. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to present, I'll start my timer here. I'm going to present work joined with Shomik Ferrari, who's at North at UChicago, and Ken Munger, who is now at EUI. And so, as probably everyone in this room is aware, there is widespread public concern about political deepfakes, right? So a deepfake is a video, or potentially also audio or an image. Oh, yeah. In this case, in the political context, a political figure doing or saying that which they never did nor said. And so the concern is rooted in the idea that the barriers to entry of creating this sort of media have massively decreased recently. So you could make this sort of media a few decades ago, but to do so you'd need something like, a Hollywood recording studio. Now you can do it with the phone in your pocket, right? And the worry is that they might be used to spread something like war-related misinformation, accuse an electoral rival of a scandal, and potentially have widespread consequences that we are obviously not too keen on. And so it's an open empirical question, though, rooted in the idea that seeing is believing. So the notion is that if you can create a deepfake of someone doing or saying what they didn't say or do, you'll believe it more than you would other forms of media. More generally, though, in a lot of recent studies in political communication and media, we know that we document, in general, these minimal persuasive effects, so in things like advertisements and the news media. And so it's sort of an open question. Is this a sort of well-founded empirical concern, or is this maybe an overblown consideration? And so we began this project with 3 research questions. I should say we started working on this a long time ago. This is like a long-running project. We have other papers that we're working on as well. And we were asking the following questions. We wanted to know, are deepfakes of political elites more credible or more affectively appealing relative to equivalent information in extant media? So not just are we able to mislead you with this particular deepfake, but can we do so more than we would have been able to with, say, just a lie in written text, or more than we would have been able to with just sort of misclipping, say, some audio recording of you, right? Second, we wanted to know, are those credibility perceptions or those affective appeals heterogeneous across subgroups? Third, are deepfakes of political elites discernible from authentic videos, right? And so on that second question, that question about moderation, we were thinking about the kind of main moderators you might think about in this context. So things like digital literacy, political knowledge. The target of our deepfake is a woman, and so we were thinking about sexism, partisanship, and so on. So those were kind of our core interests there. And so to answer these questions, we did 2 experiments on 1 sample. So we sampled around 17,000 Americans. We dropped inattentive respondents. We also dropped anyone who failed to check to, say, be able to listen audio, so a sort of can you hear what you're seeing on the survey. We were left with around slightly less than 6,000 otherwise representative subjects. And we did 2 experiments. So in the first, we did what we have termed an incidental exposure experiment, where we planted a fake scandal in a news feed. So this was meant to kind of approximate the idea that you're sort of scrolling on your phone through your social media app of choice, and then you come across a story, a scandal, supported with some sort of media. Now, it could be that that media is going to be a lie in text. It could be that that media is supported by a deepfake, right? And so we had 5 different scandals. One about political insincerity, one rooted in a sincere controversy, a novel controversy. And then we did a second experiment, a detection task. And so in that, we had an experiment where we used 15 videos. 9 of them were real, 6 were fake, and we varied the proportion that people saw. So some people saw more or less deepfakes effectively. So here's a big overview. So in that incidental exposure experiment, we assigned people to either the text of the scandal, an audio recording of the scandal, the political deepfake, and what we termed a skit. So here's how we made them. So we hired a professional Elizabeth Warren impersonator. I'm happy to talk more about why we picked Elizabeth Warren. But we hired a professional Elizabeth Warren impersonator, and we recorded her being involved in these different scandals. We then used that as the basis to create our own deepfakes. So they ran on the WashU cluster for a long time, and then we did this in collaboration with industry leaders in the Bay to make sure that we were making actually like cutting-edge deepfakes. And so with that collaboration, we were left with deepfakes about those different scandals I told you about. And then we also used, as media, just a textual description of the scandal. We used what we called the skit clip. It's sort of, you can think about it as kind of the cheap fake. And that was just the undeepfaked version of the scandal. So just the video recording of the actor, right? So think about it as analogous to like clipping something from SNL, you know? And so that was our first part of the experiment. And then we did that detection task where people were either assigned to see 8 authentic videos, 6 authentic at 2 deepfakes, 2 authentic and 6 deepfakes. And then we had the subjects try to decide which of those were deepfakes and which weren't. And so the survey flow is basically like normal demographic questions. We had an intervention where we gave people information about deepfakes or not before that first exposure task. And then they saw whichever scandal they were assigned to in whichever form of media they were assigned to in the middle of this newsfeed. And then we had a post-exposure questionnaire where we asked about, do you think that this clipping was fake or doctored? And then a feeling thermometer question as well. And then in that detection task, we asked people, again, is this clipping fake or doctored, before the sequence of videos that they were randomly assigned to. So here are 2 examples. The left one is a deepfake. We didn't make the deepfakes in this portion of the experiment. The left one is a deepfake where Donald Trump announces that AIDS is over. That is, in fact, a deepfake. The right one is a real video of Barack Obama being involved in what was then sort of a small scandal, where he tells Medvedev that he'll have more flexibility after the election, and you know, that was sort of the question. Can they tell that that is in fact real, or do they think that that one's falsely a deepfake? And so there were a lot of trade-offs in the design. I'm happy to talk more about them. Why did we use Elizabeth Warren? She was, we think, a prime target for videos of this sort. She had some mild controversies in her political career. She was at the time relatively salient. We thought that gender would sort of lead to women being attacked more often and so often, and so on. Why did we use these clips in the detection task? We picked the highest quality ones we could. Right, so that was sort of our motivating idea. And then we picked the most analogous kind of real videos that we could, conditional on picking those deepfake videos. Why credibility and not deception? Some people have asked us. We don't actually find any real differences here, but happy to think more about those distinctions moving forward. So what did we find? So on research question 1, we did not find that deepfakes were more credible than comparable fake media. So here I'm showing you the results of just the comparisons between the deepfake video and then the audio clipping from that professional actor and the textual description of that scandal. You can see, right, by like an ocular test, there are no differences between those conditions. And so we do not find that the scandal supported by a political deepfake is more credible than comparable media. We also don't find that they affect affect more than comparable media. So here are the average responses on that feeling thermometer across those different conditions, and we don't see movement. At least when we compare, say, something like the deepfake video to something like, here the ad is a negative campaign ad, or the textual description, and so on. On research question 2, the variation in credibility effects, right? So is it the case that maybe there's some like lurking heterogeneity here that we're missing? We don't see any real heterogeneity. So mostly it appears that there's not obvious large moderating effects by those pre-registered moderators for credibility, nor for affect. So similarly, we see a whole lot of null. Now, I think experiment 2 ends up being, experiment 1 took all the work, because that was where we were like working with professional actors and working with a tech company, annoying the WashU cluster by running a bunch of stuff on GPUs and hogging resources. That was the hard part, but I think the second experiment actually is where we get the most interesting substantive results. So first, we find in general that people do a pretty poor job at detecting deepfakes. So they do slightly better than random at detection. So that deepfake accuracy detection result is better than random guessing, but not tremendously better. If we look at what predicts detection success here, we see some, I think, maybe silver lining results, which is that highly digitally literate and highly politically knowledgeable respondents do considerably better than those who score lower on those measures. We don't see, and this is, I think, the interesting part of this study. So here I'm showing you the accuracy of respondents across just the deepfake videos first. So I'm going to show you how accurately they classified the deepfake videos and then the real videos. And so this is split out by the separate deepfake videos they saw. So that top video is a fake debate involving Hillary Clinton. And so most people, in fact, thought that that was a real video. Now, I don't think they thought that because it was an especially, it was a better deepfake in terms of quality than the others. But they thought that, I think, because it was a pretty believable context for Hillary Clinton to be in. It was a pretty mundane-looking debate. And so I think most people saw that. This is my speculative guess. Most people saw that and thought, this sort of accords with my priors about the sorts of things that Hillary Clinton will do. And so I suspect that, in fact, this one is real, not because of some feature of the video itself, but because of the content of the video. This is believable. It passes a snuff test. I buy it. Now, the one that was most accurately classified as a deepfake, thank you, is a deepfake depicting Donald Trump resigning or announcing his resignation from the presidency. I think here, most people thought that that was a deepfake, not, again, because it was massively more obviously a deepfake in terms of its, say, visual signatures, something in the audio, or so on, but because it was the content itself seemed unbelievable to people. It didn't accord with what they thought Donald Trump would say or do. And so here, I think this variation is a function of kind of accordance with these pre-existing beliefs about politics, a sort of a reasoning about the likelihood of these events, rather than the fidelity of the deepfake. Now, I think this is the most interesting result from the paper. We see a large gap in the false positive rate. So these are videos that were real, right? And these are this is the accuracy of classification for real videos amongst respondents. And so what we see that's interesting is the difference by party ID of the respondent. So if the person depicted in the deepfake is a co-partisan, we see that respondents were more likely to believe that that scandalous video of that co-partisan, which is in fact not a deepfake, is actually a deepfake. So they dismiss something they don't want to believe or that doesn't accord with their kind of partisan-motivated reasoning. They dismiss it as a deepfake, again, not because it looks like a deepfake. There's nothing in these videos that we didn't try to make them seem deepfaked. They're just the raw video recording of these political figures. And so that Russian hot mic video that I mentioned, 50% of Republicans accurately classified it as being sincere, whereas 20% of Democrats did. So 80% of Democrats thought that one's actually got to be a deepfake. Conversely, a video of Donald Trump announcing precautions for COVID-19. For that video, we actually saw 80% of Republicans getting that one right, 50% of Democrats. And then when things get kind of politically innocuous, like a video that's sort of a slightly cringe video of Elizabeth Warren, for instance, like just drinking a beer in her kitchen, sort of people were kind of mostly indifferent, and it seems like there wasn't much difference by party. And so, again, happy to talk more about this. We were very worried about ethics at the time of running the study. We didn't want to mislead people about scandalous things. So we debriefed twice in the study. We did active debriefing. People had to write or type that the video or audio or text they saw was false. We did this experiment when Elizabeth Warren was not running in an election. And again, our general argument is we're all going to be exposed to these sorts of media. It's just going to be an inevitable part of being on the internet these days. And so hopefully there is more benefit than harm in potentially informing people about the existence of these media. So the high-level summary of the results is that we do not find that AI-generated videos are a dramatic leap beyond existing modalities. They're not more credible. They're not more affectively appealing than, say, something like lying in text or misclipping someone in audio or video. However, these false positives are concerning. That's, I think, a generally a widely held view. And these two results are, I think, mostly in line with a lot of sort of related studies in the space. Again, we also worry too that as this technology improves, this partisanship finding might matter even more, right? It might become harder to tell the difference, and it might, again, we might see those selective dismissal, or that selective dismissal of real media become even more of an issue. So thank you, and I will conclude there.
And right on time. I'm impressed. And don't forget your phone.
Oh, yes, thank you.
All right, Kylan Rutherford, postdoc from NYU.
Slides loaded up. Right, I saw her loading up slides. I don't know how to get them back. Thank you. Sorry for my technical ineptitude. Thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited to talk about this. This is a project we ran a field experiment earlier this year, and super excited to talk about some results and get your feedback. What we're going to be talking about today is how AI search engines operate compared to traditional search engines. So the question, and this is a question that our lab, before I even got there, was working on, do traditional search engines help people evaluate misinformation? A common encouragement, especially like in an election setting or a setting where we think misinformation might be occurring, a lot of these misinformation health checklists say, hey, if you see something suspicious, you should search online for more information. Our question was, does this actually help? And our lab found it actually doesn't. In many cases, online searches, when you're evaluating misinformation, can actually lead an individual to be more likely to believe it. There are a few reasons. I'm not going to get into the specifics of this study, but this was kind of a puzzling finding that we noticed and potentially concerning, because we're encouraging people to search, and that might actually be reinforcing, making them more familiar with misinformation stories, putting them in a situation where there's not a good fact check there anyway, so they're just seeing more of the misinformation stuff. So the question that I'm going to discuss today, and what our experiment focuses on, is, can an AI search engine mitigate this effect? So thinking about, a traditional search engine potentially is going to reinforce if we're using something like ChatGPT or Perplexity, something that is geared towards search, but is also providing an AI summary or some more context, or potentially is searching online more effectively. Can it mitigate this effect of reinforcing misinformation? The roadmap for the presentation, I'm going to start by just talking about kind of what these two tools are, why they're different, set up the experimental design, and then talk about results. Spoiler alert, AI search engine does outperform a traditional search engine, but it's not perfect. And we'll talk about kind of why we think this might be happening and the next steps. A traditional search engine, we're all familiar with it. We're getting less and less familiar with it because even the old school search engines are now forcing AI on you. But before that happened, what a search engine would do is you'd give it a query. They were optimized for keyword search. Asking it a question is actually worse than just plugging in specific words. And the process is they have a database of websites and documents. They use keyword matching and relevance ranking to give you a list of URLs for you to then look for more information. They don't actually give you an answer, or they didn't. An AI search engine is actually optimized for natural language questions. They don't work as well with a keyword search. They want you to ask a question. And what they do is different. So there's a lot of technical stuff that I won't get into. But an LLM in general, when we talk about ChatGPT like 2 years ago, was just using its training data. Now they do what's called retrieval augmented generation, where not only does it have its training data, but it can search online. And now all of these models are building basically a search engine within their tool. And then there's also a level of alignment where the company says, you can say this, you can't say this, or this is how we want you to say it, this is how we don't want you to say it. And then the output, rather than a ranked list of URLs, is a natural language response. It actually gives you an answer. It'll also often now give you links. It'll give you ostensibly the sources that it's pulling its information from. So these are the two things we're going to be comparing. We're going to pull Google for our traditional search engine and Perplexity for our AI search engine. I can talk about the choice later. At the time of the experiment, it was by far the best option because the free version of ChatGPT didn't have this retrieval augmented generation thing in its free version. So Perplexity was really the only option that we could use. The design for the experiment. First, we used like a feed aggregator to select a bunch of very recent news articles. So we're looking for articles that are within 1 to 2 days of publication at the start of the experiment. We want something that's recent. We want it to be related to US politics. And then we pull each week for the experiment. We ran this for 8 weeks, 7 weeks, 8 weeks with 1 week that we had to pause. And we pull one article from each of these streams. So one of them is going to be mainstream conservative, one's liberal. Then we have some low quality conservative, liberal, and unclear. Then we have, before we give it to participants, we have a team of fact checkers go through and actually, we have 5 of them and we take a majority vote to get a rating for is this true or is this false/misleading. Then we get a bunch of survey participants, we ask some demographic questions, and then we give them this article. The question that we're going to ask them is the central claim of the article true, false, or misleading, or could you not determine? And the treatment, they're going to be in one of 3 conditions. The control group, they're just going to read an article. The other 2 treatment groups, the AI search engine group, they're going to be told, read this article and also use Perplexity, an AI tool, to help you evaluate if this is true, false, or misleading. Another group is going to get Google and told the same thing. Use this as a tool to help you evaluate. In the process of this experiment, before they start, we have them download a custom browser extension called News Evaluation. We built this. Shout out to Edwin in our team. This allows us to track everything they do online during the experiment. So when they go to Google, we know that they hit Google. We know what they searched. We know all of the links that were given. We know which links they clicked on. Same thing for Perplexity. We know what the query was, what Perplexity responds with, all of the links if they click on the links. What we're going to be looking at is, the main one is just, is this an improvement relative to the traditional search engine? And also, how does it compare to the control group? So our prior base on our pilot study was that it's still going to slightly increase belief in misinformation. It's still going to have this effect relative to control, but it's going to be an improvement relative to the traditional search engine. As far as mechanisms, the first one we're looking at is it providing more or less unreliable links? In the prior study, that's one thing that we found is the more low quality links Google was giving, the more likely an individual was to believe misinformation. So we're going to check, is Perplexity better at recommending high quality content? The other thing is we're going to look at lazy search strategies. So depending on how intensely or passively somebody is engaging with this experiment, is the tool going to be more or less helpful for them? Just a little bit more context on what we're going to be looking at with search strategies. These are super granular. We're going to get more deep into like some natural language processing of the queries, but for now we're looking at, did they submit more than one query? We only required them to do one. Are they going above and beyond? And also, did the user just copy and paste the URL? We found that a lot of people, rather than actually read the article and think about it, they just say, copy paste, is this true? And go for it. So we're going to be looking at how these search strategies might impact the results. We ended up getting a little over 4,000 participants. Each of them is going to look at one article, one of the 5 each week. This totals to about 34 articles. Each article hits about 120 participants. 15 were false or misleading, 19 were true, based on our fact checker ratings. As far as compliance, this is kind of the first interesting thing. Control, some people cheat. Ironically, we didn't pay them to get the political knowledge questions right, but people still cheat to try to get those right. With the article, some of them did use Google. Only one we observed used a chat bot. I think we'd probably see that increase if we ran it today. Google, people are very compliant. If we told them you can use Google, most of them did. Perplexity, even though we told them you have to do this and we forced the thing to open up on their device, a little under half of them still didn't actually use the tool. Again, we think that this would increase if we did it today. Even over our experiment, we saw it increase a little bit over the weeks. Here are our first results. So on the right, we see true articles. So this is good news. When something is true and an individual uses either of these tools, Perplexity on the top, Google on the bottom, they're more likely to believe it. That's something that we would love to see. On the left, we see what happens with false or misleading articles. And just to explain kind of the black and purple lines, black is everybody who's assigned to that group. Purple is people who actually use the tool that they were assigned to use or didn't use a tool if they were told not to use it. So we call those compliers. If we look over at the false and misleading articles, this is kind of the effect that we don't like seeing with Google. That it's a little bit lower of an effect, but like Google is about as good at making you believe something whether or not it's true. They're more likely to believe it even though the article was false or misleading. Perplexity is a little different. One, even just amongst everybody who's assigned, we see it's a smaller effect. If we zoom in on just the people who actually complied, it drops out of statistical significance. So the overall finding, and also with true articles, it's slightly less persuasive at getting people to believe, but still in the same ballpark. We're splitting hairs at that point. So the main takeaway is Perplexity does a little bit better, but it's not like, ideally in a perfect world, what we want to see is Perplexity makes people way less likely to believe something if it's not true. We see it's a little bit reinforcing, but at least it's dropping to a lower rate. As far as unreliable links, trying to get into why this is happening, there's actually, if we look at percentage of unreliable links, there's not really any difference. It's about 1%. However, there's percentage might not be the right way to think about it because Google gives about 10 links per page. Perplexity maybe gives 4 or 5. So looking at magnitude and volume of the unreliable links, it's a little bit different, but percentage is about the same. This kind of going into search strategies, so that I've boxed out, as far as multiple queries, the more questions you ask, the more likely you are to get an unreliable link. That's pretty obvious. As far as copying and pasting a URL, this is something that's interesting because in the last study, when we were just looking at Google, we saw that copying and pasting, actually you were more likely to get an unreliable link if you gave it an unreliable URL to interact with. It seems like Google's improved a little bit. It's dropped out of statistical significance. Our team talked to them, so something got through. Perplexity, this is interesting. If you copy and paste a link, which is something that's a little bit more lazy, Perplexity actually does better at giving you high quality stuff. So if you say, hey, here's this sketchy article, think about it, it seems like some sort of alignment, and again, we can't look under the hood. They seem to tighten up and get a little bit better at recommending high quality links in their response. As far as how these search strategies affect belief, multiple queries doesn't seem to really impact how likely somebody is to believe. But copying and pasting the URL actually goes counter to what we thought. We thought that people who were lazy were going to be worse off. It seems that actually copying and pasting a URL helps Perplexity do a little bit better. It actually decreases, the mouse is covering that negative sign. There we go. It decreases the likelihood that they are to believe it. We think that a lot of this might be due to how a traditional search engine and an AI search engine interacts with the URL. If you give a traditional search engine a URL, it tries to find relevance. So a lot of times what we find is in the links that it would recommend anything that like literally had that URL on its page. Or if there was a tweet that had that URL in the tweet, that was more likely to get elevated. The AI search engine, the way it's designed to interact with that is it's actually, if you give it a URL, it reads the URL and it interacts with the content on that page rather than trying to find that URL itself across the web. So we think that might be part of the reason that this is helping. As far as the discussion, it does seem that like if we're thinking about measured improvements, again, not is AI good in a vacuum, but is AI good relative to what people have been using? It does seem that this is a measured improvement relative to traditional search engine, but it's still slightly worse than the control. Ironically, people might be better off just not searching for more information and just not thinking about the misinformation any more than they have to. A little bit more on why this might matter. It might be better at sourcing high quality links, but it doesn't seem like that's the main driver. The AI context chunk, that's something that we're going to be getting into as we continue to analyze this data and as we run follow-up experiments. Is that additional summary the driving factor? Is giving an answer rather than just giving a bunch of links something that matters? And also something that's evolving is how much do people trust these tools? We saw that it was harder to get somebody to actually use the AI tool than to use Google. Getting them to trust the answer is also a question. And then which of these tools is better for lazy searchers, and is that who we really care about? If we're worried about the spread of misinformation, do we want to help the people who are really actively engaged, or do we want to help the people who are going to really exert the minimum amount of effort and tailor our interventions to them? It does seem like, at least for the people who are going to copy and paste the URL, AI search engine is going to be a more helpful tool. The irony of this, and all of this is evolving as we speak, but in general, policies at platforms like Google have withheld these AI summaries in contentious areas. So a lot of, in our study, Google was starting to roll out Gemini. We saw virtually no Gemini summaries for our Google group because we were looking at very recent articles about political topics that might be misinformation, and they were not allowing their AI to interact with it. Ironically, if we believe these findings, this might be a space where the AI engine actually can help. But the question is, do you want to, like as a platform, do you want to be responsible for giving an answer rather than just giving a bunch of links and saying, you think for yourself? And that's it.
Thanks a lot. Now, Mike Tomz from Stanford.
And do we know how to make this go full screen?
The diagonal arrow and click on the diagonal.
Here?
Yeah.
Great. Okay. Hi. Thanks, everyone. Good morning. This morning, I'm presenting a project that I've been working on with Josh Goldstein at Georgetown. The project is about deepfakes in political campaigns. And Chris set this up well for us. We're concerned about deepfakes as a possible new threat to democracy. There are several possible concerns as campaigns might be tempted to incorporate deepfakes into their campaign messaging. If politicians increasingly use deepfakes in campaigns, that might make it difficult for voters to make informed choices to the extent that they're fooled by the content of deepfakes. There's also the possibility that deepfakes could deter talented leaders from running for office if they anticipate that running for office will only invite deepfakes against them that would tarnish their reputations. And finally, we worry about more systemic effects. The proliferation of deepfakes in campaigns could decrease confidence in democracy. What do we know about deepfakes so far? Well, some of it is based on Chris's research and research of others in the room. People have trouble discerning deepfakes, that is, differentiating deepfakes from authentic content. We also know from some experimental studies that deepfakes can harm or tarnish the images of depicted politicians. And we know from studies that deepfakes can erode trust in traditional news sources. What we don't know is what might deter politicians from engaging in the use of deepfakes in campaigns. And so in this project that I'll be describing today, there are two essential research questions. The first is what could deter politicians from running deepfakes? There are many possible strategies to consider. Of course, there are top-down strategies in which either a government or a platform puts restrictions on deepfakes. But there are also bottom-up possibilities in which the electorate itself is the enforcer defending democracy. And that's the possibility that we're exploring in this paper here. So electoral punishment, that is, would citizens stand up for democracy by punishing candidates for incorporating deepfakes into their campaigns? We also ask a secondary question, that is, if deterrence fails and politicians actually use deepfakes in campaigns, how would that affect faith in democracy? Would that undermine trust in the results of elections? Would that prevent people from having confidence in the democratic system? Would it cause citizens to disengage from politics by not voting in elections? So those are our primary research questions. What's our empirical approach in this paper? Like many others at this conference, we use an experiment. You might think, why not use historical data? We can't really rely on historical data to answer this question for a few reasons. The first is that, fortunately, as of now, there are still relatively few cases of deepfakes. There are also many confounders that would make it difficult for us to identify or isolate the effect of deepfakes on support for a candidate as compared to all the other factors that could influence support for a candidate. And finally, there's the issue of selection bias. Politicians, to the extent that they might use deepfakes, might look ahead and try to use them only in cases where they think the blowback would be relatively low. So we might end up underestimating what would be the consequences of more widespread use of deepfakes in campaigns. So for all of these reasons, historical data is not a good guide for figuring out how voters would respond to deepfakes. Instead, we turn to experiments. And we ran a pre-registered survey experiment in September 2023 about the 2024 presidential election with a sample size of just larger than 3,000 people. To spill the beans, what were our key findings? We can really categorize them into two buckets. The first is what we call fragile punishment. We find, and I'll document this in more detail in a few minutes, that voters would punish politicians who are caught running a deepfake in a campaign, but that punishment is fragile to the extent that precedent, that is, prior use of deepfakes by other politicians, will allow politicians to get off the hook for using deepfakes themselves. And using rhetoric to justify their use of deepfakes can also minimize the punishment, driving it in some cases to zero. So that's the first concern. The second concern is what we call deepfake disillusionment, and that is that if deterrence fails and politicians incorporate deepfakes into campaigns, they would reduce trust in elections, reduce faith in democracy, and reduce the willingness of citizens to participate. So we have systemic concerns that we need to be worried about as well. Okay. I'll very briefly go through this theoretical portion of the paper, and then I'll focus more on the empirical results. But as I said, this is a pre-registered experiment. We pre-registered a set of hypotheses. The first hypothesis is the voters would punish candidates for using deepfakes. That is, that support for candidates who run deepfakes will be lower than support for candidates who do not, all other factors equal. Why do we think that? Of course, voters evaluate candidates on many different dimensions, but one important dimension that voters care about is the character of politicians, that is, their competence and integrity. And we suggest that deepfakes are a bad signal about a candidate because if they're caught running a deepfake, that could suggest that they're dishonest, that could suggest that they're a cheater, not engaging in fair play, and all of those would be a mark against the candidate's character in a campaign. All right. That may seem self-evident to you. To us, it was not obvious, and it's a reason why we wanted to run this research, because there are many counterpoint reasons to think that voters might not actually punish candidates for running deepfakes in campaigns. Why would we think they might not? Well, you might think voters are already highly desensitized to misinformation. In this misinformation environment, this is one additional dose that's not going to hurt a candidate any more than they have already been tainted in the process. The second possibility is that politicians can enjoy plausible deniability. It wasn't me. It was someone on my campaign or an interest group that ran that deep fake. So don't blame me, don't undercut my character because of that. Third possibility is that voters engage in motivated reasoning, thinking that they essentially apply double standards to their own candidates from their own party versus candidates from the other party. And finally, voters might ultimately prioritize party over ethics, saying, all right, that was ethically dubious, but we need to win this election, and so I'm willing to give my candidate a pass for running a deepfake. So it wasn't obvious to us that punishment would occur. We also wanted to look at context because we think some of these ethical judgments about candidates very much depend on the context in which the deepfake was run. And so we looked at two particular moderators, precedent and rhetoric. With respect to precedent, we hypothesized that support for candidates who run deepfakes would be higher when the opponent has already run a deepfake. Why would we think that? If you believe that a deepfake is dishonest or unfair, but an opponent has already run a deepfake, responding in kind by running a deepfake of your own could help restore fairness, competitive fairness in the campaign. Or if you're into retribution or retributive justice, it could achieve retributive justice. It may also be a tit-for-tat type strategy that could deter defection by the other side. So for all those reasons, voters might be more forgiving of a candidate who ran a deepfake in retaliation against a previous one. The second moderator we looked at is the role of justification. There are many ways that politicians might justify a deepfake. We consider two possibilities: social comparisons and contextualization. Social comparison is my opponent is a liar, so this deepfake is justified. Contextualization is, well, there are other goals or higher priorities that we need to take into account. We must do everything possible to win this election, defeat the opposition. So we hypothesize that support for candidates who run deepfakes will be higher if they justify in one of these ways than if they deny running a deepfake or avoid commenting on the deepfake. Finally, deepfake disillusionment. Our hypotheses here was that deepfakes would erode the epistemic foundations of democracy. How would they do that? By undermining trust in hard evidence. It used to be that if someone made a political claim, you could fact check it by looking at the video or listening to the audio. But if even that can be synthetic now, then voters don't have the same source of information, or the media doesn't have the same source of information to fact check. Furthermore, deepfakes could increase the cost of fact-checking and raise fears. Even if one thinks that they themselves will not be duped by deepfakes, they might worry that the rest of the electorate would, and that would be bad for trust in the results of elections. So we hypothesize that deepfakes will reduce trust in election results and faith in democracy. Okay, so what was our experiment? As I said, in September 2023, we ran an experiment where we presented hypothetical scenarios pitting a Democrat against a Republican. The Democrats in our scenario were Biden or Harris. The Republicans in our scenarios were DeSantis or Trump. In the control condition, we presented them with pairwise comparisons or trial heats between those candidates with no mention of any deepfakes. In the treatment condition, we presented a hypothetical scenario in which one of those two campaigns had run a deepfake, and we randomized some aspects of it. We ran which of the two candidates ran the deepfake, what was the content of the deepfake, that is, whether it attacked the opponent's character or attacked their policy positions. Was the deepfake precedented or unprecedented? And finally, did the candidate justify the deepfake in one of the ways that I had mentioned previously? We measured two categories of outcomes that align with the hypotheses I mentioned before. So support for candidates. We first asked them in a forced choice, which of these two candidates would you prefer? And second, we asked how would you vote as between these candidates, where we also gave them the option to abstain from voting if they chose to do so. And then for deepfake disillusionment, we measured confidence in institutions. If events happen just as we described, how much would you trust or distrust the results of the election? How much faith would you have in American democracy? I'll skip this example just in the interest of time, but we can come back to it later if you want. What did we find? So On average, we found that voters punished candidates who ran deepfakes, and I'll focus on the first of those dependent variables, the forced choice between candidates about which candidate you would prefer, but the conclusions are the same with the vote-dependent variable as well. What you see here on the screen on the horizontal axis is measured the average effect, that is the average percentage point change in support for the candidate, and on average, across our candidates and across our scenarios, support for the candidate dropped by about 8 percentage points when the candidate was caught red-handed running a deepfake. We found that precedent reduced the punishment. That is, the punishment when in the absence of a precedent was about 12 percentage points, fell to only 5 percentage points when the other candidate had run a deepfake, so a difference of 7 points. And that rhetoric also had some mitigating effect, but not one in this experiment that on average was statistically significant. And finally, perhaps most worrisome, we found that the combination of precedent and rhetoric wiped out the cost to the candidate for running a deepfake. That is, if the other side had previously run a deepfake and the candidate brought that to the attention of the voters in their rhetoric, the estimated penalty was effectively 0, which raises a real threat of what we call a deepfake race to the bottom, where each side engages in tit-for-tat deepfakes against each other, knowing that they can do so with impunity. We found similar patterns for vote shares, which is the other dependent variable, and for each of the different candidates. If you are wondering whether some candidates showed these patterns and others not, it worked the same for Trump, Biden, DeSantis, and Harris. All right. The last thing I want to talk about, the last empirical result, is that deepfakes reduced trust in elections and democracy. So this is trust in elections. Of course, people don't trust elections even in the absence of deepfakes. But this is on a scale from 0 to 100 people's trust in the results of the election and faith in democracy. In the control condition where there was no deepfake for trust in election, the value is 63, declining to 46 if candidates ran deepfakes. And similarly, faith in democracy dropped from 56 to 39 when voters were informed that candidates were inserting deepfakes into their campaigns. The last worrisome effect I want to highlight here is that deepfakes also drove voters to abstain, and for this we go back to our dependent variable about how would you vote in the election. It turns out that when we give the candidates these scenarios and we ask, would you vote for one of these two candidates or would you stay home, more than 10% of the electorate said, in that case, I just wouldn't vote in the presidential election. The average effect is about 12 percentage points, and across the board here, the effect is more like around 10 plus percentage points. So let me just conclude here by saying this, we think, is a mixed and very troubling message about the possibility of deepfakes. The good news, if you want to find some in this presentation, is that on average, voters in our experiment did punish candidates, providing a potential deterrent for candidates to run deepfakes in a campaign. And maybe belief about this is one of the reasons why deepfakes weren't so widespread in 2024, though I fear that that will change. The bad news is that punishment was fragile and could be neutralized by precedent. Once one or more candidates introduces deepfakes into a campaign, the gloves are off, and other candidates can do this without punishment, and rhetoric only further allows them to escape punishment. And perhaps the worst news is that once deepfakes get out into the wild in these ways in campaigns, they'll undermine democracy by reducing faith in the results of the election, reducing trust in democracy, and demoralizing voters to the extent that many would choose not to participate in elections. So let me stop there. Thanks.
And the last paper will be Mitchell Linegar, PhD candidate from Caltech.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm here today to present some joint work with Betsy and Mike. So if you don't like this presentation, you're not welcome back next year. So I actually feel great that Mike really helped set me up. As we've been talking about throughout this whole conference, trust really is at the heart of democracy and democratic institutions. And so a lack of trust in institutions implies a lack of trust in the outcomes. We have seen this repeatedly in the last couple of years. I don't think we need any reminders of that. Around a third of Americans at any given point in time in the last 15 or 20 years have believed at least one false rumor about American elections, and this has become more widespread recently. I'm sure you can all imagine why, but certainly as political elites endorse rumors, they become more widespread and more widely believed. So in this talk, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be trying to persuade you that we can use AI as a tool to reduce confidence in election rumors and thus restore confidence in American election institutions as a whole. So as we all know, social media is just full of these like false rumors of one form or another. As I think Amy Cohen was saying yesterday, bad actors intentionally spread misinformation, and AI lowers the barriers to entry. And so this is going to be really important because already before the advent of like OpenAI and ChatGPT, traditional fact-checking was just completely unable to actually keep pace with the sheer volume of misinformation. And now, here we are a few years later, and that we don't even have to have humans be producing misinformation. We have computers to do it for us. So we need some sort of scalable solution that we can use to help rebuild trust, and that's what we're trying to do in this project. So just very generally, there are 3 techniques that are commonly used for countering misinformation. The most common that you're all familiar with is just debunking. There's a piece of fake news. You tell someone, hey, this thing is fake, you probably shouldn't believe it. And this turns out this happens after exposure, but as a result, it's typically coming too late in order to actually prevent any damage. And what's worse is that oftentimes people won't even see the debunk that you've presented. So an alternative is you can use pre-bunking. You can build resistance before exposure by presenting weakened doses of the piece of hopefully or potentially persuasive misinformation. And what this is going to do is this is going to teach voters to spot misinformation tactics. And you can think about this as being a pre-bunk, so like a vaccination, essentially, for misinformation. And that's going to be our focus for this paper today. One other thing that's related to these that we're also going to do, and that several of the papers that we've been talking about at this conference have done, is having just direct conversations with voters. This makes it so they can have like a back and forth. And so we're going to have a comparison between using automated or different types of AI tools to have these types of conversations. So on the one hand, we can have AI articles. On the other hand, we'll have AI conversations. And we'll be comparing the efficacy of these in a little bit. Okay, so I just kind of walked through this bit, but what we were generally doing, and you can see on our website later, is we have an AI article generator and an AI chatbot, both of which are going to be pre-bunking various pieces of elections misinformation. Okay, so how did we actually, this is a little old maybe, but when we were first starting to think about how do we actually produce good prompts in order to actually create these effective inoculation doses, what do we actually do? Well, we started with a full exposure article. I'll call these articles full exposures, and you should be thinking about these as persuasive human-written articles containing pieces of misinformation, in this case about voter fraud. In all cases, these full exposure articles are going to be written by Breitbart, so we can keep kind of like a consistent style of writing and make sure that other than changing the input rumor, the level of persuasiveness is going to hopefully remain about the same. All right, so we take this full exposure article, we take a series of election security facts, in this case from CISA, which unfortunately we need to find a new source for this. And then we use this to produce, and we have we have a prompt. And then we use all these 3 things to produce an AI article that's pushing it back against this false rumor. then we then feed this to human review. In this case, we had a psychologist. So the psychologist and Sander would sit down and debate edits to the article, and we repeated this process until finally we arrived at a final prompt, and then we use this to produce all the other articles. Okay, so given this final prompt, which I'll call prompt star, we start with our 5 election myths. We produce 5 different pre-bunking articles, and then we have articles for each of these rumors. So now I can actually get into the experimental setup. Like all of the rest of the talks today, we're doing a series of survey experiments. We have around 4,000 likely voters from YouGov, so we have like a nationally representative sample. Registered two-wave survey experiment, and in each case we're going to have both a treatment and a placebo. The treatment and placebo are both going to be from the AI, which we think helps increase the internal validity just by making sure the comparisons are reasonable. Okay, so what are we actually doing? Well, maybe this is a little hard to see, but we ask our pre-treatment questions, we randomize to a particular myth, we then randomize to treatment or control, and then if you were treated, you read an AI-written pre-bunking article, in this case about voter fraud. Otherwise, you read an AI-written article about something neutral, in this case about remote work. You then read the full exposure article, answer your post-treatment questions, and then a week later, we have a series of follow-up questions that we ask. All right, so this also might be a little hard to see, but on the x-axis you can see the pre-treatment level of confidence that each of the respondents assigned to their rumor. So if you had a rumor about non-citizen voting, this is saying on a scale from 0 to 10, you gave it a 10 or a 0. We then have our treatment, and people read the articles, and what do we see? And then that's on the y-axis. All right, so what do we actually see? Well, first of all, we see that if we look at the placebo group, which is in gray variously here, but you can see the mean of the placebo group is higher than the mean of the control group, or the treated group, which in this case means that they have a higher average rate of belief in these false rumors. So kind of the interesting thing to see here is that the placebo group is actually going from a pre-treatment mean of 4.9 to a post-treatment mean of 5.3 or so, which means that they actually are being persuaded that the rumor is true on average, which is, yes, that's bad. On the other hand, the treated group is going from 4.85 to 4.78, so they're slightly declining. So we're not only protecting people on average, we're actually like slightly reversing the persuasive effect. Okay, so if we sort of aggregate this, we can see this is the same plot repeated. We see in general, we're quite effective at reducing confidence in each of these individual election rumors. When we measure the effect a week later, this effect is durable. And if we if we take the same type of plot, but rather than ask about rumor confidence, if we instead ask about election confidence, what we see is that we are also able, even though this is not what we were trying to do, we're also able to increase confidence that the national election was well run, although this does not hold after a week. So we're encouraged by this, but our main focus is, of course, on the election rumors themselves. Okay, so that was our first paper. After this, we repeated a very similar setup. We reduced the number of rumors from 5 to 2 so we could increase power, but we had otherwise very similar sample size, broadly the same set of questions. But this time we had an additional layer of randomization. This time we randomized it, to assign people to the article or to a chatbot. And what we were finding, and in this case, if you were assigned to the chatbot, you'd be assigned to a placebo version of the chatbot if you're in the control condition. So we had 2 separate controls. And we tried our best to keep we obviously kept the actual AI in question the same, and we tried our best to keep the set of input information and the prompts to also be the same. This makes it much easier to have direct comparisons. And then we're going to be asking the same sets of questions. All right, so what do we find? We find that, at least for reducing rumor confidence or protecting against increased rumor confidence, we see that both formats are equally effective. We see no statistically significant differences between articles and chatbots for having what we might term like informational interventions. So if the question is this election rumor true or false, you can give someone an article, or you can have a chatbot conversation, and you'll arrive at, or your respondents will arrive at basically the same answer. On the other hand, for the much more difficult task of building election confidence, chatbots were significantly more effective. And this is perhaps not so surprising. I mean, for one, it's much harder to build election confidence. For another, as I said before, in the articles especially, we are aiming very specifically at pushing back against rumor belief, so that the elections, that people became more confident in elections was convenient, but not necessarily our intention. Okay. All right, so now we'll be getting into some future work. This is all a little tentative. Would love to hear kind of what you guys are thinking or what might actually be useful. But one important question here is, how do we actually generalize this type of approach to either new settings or new models? So as I was outlining earlier, especially our first iteration required some like pretty high-intensive, high-effort, manually written prompts. So if we're wanting to generalize, how can we actually do this? Well, one option is we can use automatic prompt tuning, and we can construct synthetic examples for each new situation and setting. So we did this, we replicated our setup with the election bot, and then repeated this for a bunch of other types of settings where there's misinformation. And we're not yet running these experiments, but we're in the process of setting them up. And so we're trying these out with vaccines, with AI, with climate, basically anything that we can think of where there's some type of misinformation that we want to get out ahead of. And if you like, you can try this tool, or these sets of tools, at electionbot.chat is our site. But yeah, that's what I have. So yeah, just key takeaways is that we can actually use AI to do effective pre-bunking doses. We can use them to push back against false belief in election rumors. And chatbots, while they're better at increasing trust in the election, they're not always necessary, and sometimes we can use cheaper, more scalable solutions. So with that, thank you very much.
Okay, now I'm going to ask the presenters if they can come up to the table just to facilitate the Q&A. We're going to turn it over to Leah Merivaki, professor from Georgetown, to lead the Q&A. And I'll help to run the microphone. If it's okay with Leah, I want to take the chair's prerogative to ask the first question. And actually, I'm going to blame Betsy for this first question. When Betsy was introducing things yesterday, what she asked the academics to do was, I will quote, I believe, if you utter the word standard error, you need to explain what standard error is. And the term the three of y'all use, which I think is an important one, just to kind of to inform the non-academics in the room, is three of y'all mentioned pre-registration. And why is that important? And and if you're not a normal consumer of academic research like this, why is this important, and why does it lead credence to the results? And we can throw it open to anybody, or I'll call on somebody. Mike.
Why is pre-registration
Use
important?
Use the mic, Mike.
All right, here's Mike turning on the mic. Hello? It works now? Okay. Why is pre-registration important? I guess there's been a crisis of confidence in social science research because scholars have found that many studies appear not to be replicable. One possible reason for the failure of replication is that previous researchers ran a study, they fished through their data searching for a significant result. Maybe they tried 100 different things with their data, found one that seemed to pop, and then reported that, and that doesn't reliably replicate in a subsequent study. Pre-registration is one possible antidote for that problem, because you're putting your hypotheses on the table in advance. And by making those public, you tie your hands, preventing the possibility of phishing for significant results. So,
Thanks. It's very helpful. Okay, off to Leah. You're in charge.
I want to ask a question about deepfakes. Because I think, so every time I think about a deepfake, I think there's a classification that we are not employing in terms of their space. Because I think every campaign ad happens in the context of a storytelling arc for a campaign. And that's like a really important piece of context. And so it's Halloween season. So I think the piece we're missing here for deepfakes is the notion of dramatic irony. So the example I would say to you is like in Macbeth, the audience hears the witch's proclamation at the beginning. And so everyone is in on the what's going to happen to Duncan, but he doesn't know. And so I think an example for deepfakes when we think about this is like there is a space where the voter is in on it. They know that it's fake and they love it, versus the voter is trying to be tricked. And so the key distinction, I think, would be something like, suppose there was a deepfake of Harris punching Vance in the nose. I bet that would go viral faster than fast. And I think that everyone would know that's not real. So in this post-truth world, there would be universal understanding that that's not real. Versus, suppose one of our county election officials here had a deepfake made about them telling everyone to vote the one day after the election. I bet that would get people. And so I'm really interested in the testing here as to like where the timing and the narrative structure of this deepfake matters in the broader context of the campaign. Because I feel like that's the thing, is like, do we think that the audience is going to be tricked? And is that the intent? Or do we think, as Commissioner Palmer told us last night, that a lot of this is designed to shout out to the audience, are you not entertained?
Check. No. Yeah. Working. All right. Yeah. I mean, I think that's exactly right. If you look at like the prevalence of different, say, like intentions of deepfakes too, the vast majority are not. In general, they're not political. Many of the political deepfakes that exist are satirical. I think for me, the core question is the sort of like, well, what do we do with that, right? So, satirizing political candidates, either on the part of other candidates or the press or the media. It's not new, right? It's existed for a very long time. And I think the kind of core question, which I think we're still kind of unraveling, is like, what's different here about this particular medium compared to, say, what you could have done with a cartoon, a few decades ago in print media, compared to what you could have done, cheap fakes, we were talking about this yesterday, right? Cheap fakes, the kind of low quality fake that was never actually intended to convince anyone that it was real, but was meant to kind of poke fun. A lot of them work at poking fun, right? And they work at having an effect without ever trying to sort of mislead the viewer. So I think that's precisely, the right way for that literature to turn.
Go ahead.
Just briefly to add to that, because I think this is an interesting research topic, which is how implausible and funny does the scenario need to be in order for ordinary voters to be able to distinguish between a synthetic video and a real one? And per your experiments, voters struggled to distinguish real from synthetic videos, but if a politician was punching another politician in the nose, then maybe they would have done better at assuming, at least, or guessing accurately that this was false. But I think that's politicians will likely use deepfakes for both purposes, for entertainment and for deception. And I do think it's an interesting research project to figure out how far off the implausibility spectrum does it need to be before voters can figure out that it wasn't real.
Before we move to the next question, Charles, there's one in the back. I wanted to make a point about the deepfake research. I really appreciated the tit for tat frame, and I kept thinking about how much can we borrow or learn from the negative campaigning research, where voters were not happy about it at first because it's different from the opposition research, and then they were like, well, everybody's doing it, so they would not punish candidates for it because they're used to it. And how much can we apply that framework to the study of deepfakes? If everybody's doing it, what's the big deal? And to your point, Betsy, on election officials, perhaps there's a whole different aspect here because election officials have been serving a different role, right? So they would be the punishment would be higher because their job is not to spread misinformation. So that would be my response to that. But to the deepfakes discussion, I really kept thinking about maybe there's something there in the framework of negative campaigning that we should think about when we form expectations about how voters will behave and whether candidates are like, we're going to do it because, as you said, there's no punishment. So there's one question in the back, and then there's one more in the front.
And there's a couple behind you, Leah.
My question's for Mitchell. It was mentioned a few times yesterday how people can usually quickly tell if an article is written by AI, and so I wonder how you think the results might have changed if maybe you rephrased that and wrote it like a human, because I get the ick if I see an AI written article, but if you attach a name to it, that also opens up a lot of other problems, I guess.
Testing. Okay, yeah, that is a great question. At least when we were writing the articles, we spent a couple months, honestly, like tuning one of these prompts to try and make it sound as much as we could like a resident psychologist. And this makes it sound distinctly not human, honestly. Like, he doesn't talk the way that I would to a regular person. And so at least with the writing of these like very brief, very kind of stilted articles, I don't actually know if it would make a big difference just because the writing style is so far off from like how I think people tend to read things. I do really think it would make a huge difference for sure with any like the conversations, or if the writing was maybe meant more, because it's almost like a warning. Like, you might see something false or fake in the future, and this is like sort of the form that it will take. But I think it's a great question. It's something that we're really thinking about, and I think our lack of comparison with like this actual human message is really important and lacking right now.
I think there's one hand. Let's do this table first, and then we'll move to you.
Mike, I'm curious, how did you signal to folks that they were looking at a deepfake? Did you rely on them just discerning it, or was there a disclaimer?
So to clarify, in our research design, we didn't actually have people watch a video, and this is a difference between our research design and Chris's. Our experimental treatment was purely text. We described a candidate having run a deepfake, the candidate having been accused of running a deepfake, how the candidate responded to that, what the content of the video was, but we didn't actually have them watch a video. Yeah. Having them watch a deepfake video of one of the 4 candidates in a live presidential campaign might have run us into some ethical trouble and gotten us tripped up with our IRB. So we certainly didn't do that.
Thanks. Yeah, I had a similar question in some sense, Mike, because I'm trying to understand the treatment here. Like, you decided to jump right past the slide that I most wanted to see, because I really want to know, how much are you priming them that, like, all they can think about is a deep fake versus I'm telling you 20 things about this candidate. By the way, one is that during the campaign they ran this nasty deep fake. And I just didn't get any feel for it. So can you just sort of talk a little bit about how strong you think that treatment is so we can figure out something about external validity?
Sure. So it's a very strong treat. Well, first, they are real political candidates, so it's not like the first time that anyone has ever heard of Donald Trump or Biden or Harris or DeSantis. So yes, we could have provided additional information, but the media environment is providing lots of information about these 4 candidates as they're actively being considered. Having said that, in our treatment, we're not providing them with information about their policy positions on immigration or other aspects of their character. We're just asking people to entertain the possibility that one of the candidates ran a video, a synthetic video, that attacked the opponent for saying something that they never actually said or doing something that they never did. So in that way, we're making the deepfake salient. Because of that, you can think of our estimates as probably upper bound on the treatment effect that you would observe in the real world, which is actually pretty bad news if you want voters to deter politicians from running deepfakes.
So I also a question to Mike on very great research, but I was a bit curious about the interpretation of the fragility. So yes, it is about the deepfake, but I think it would be the same for the matador, right? Like for the kind of blaming other candidates about them using. So they blamed us first. We are okay to blame them as well. So what is the kind of the main thing where we should be worried about, because it is about deepfake, or it is not about the just mere criticism to the other candidates? So I was so just a question about your kind of interpretation about it.
Can you rephrase just a little bit so I can make sure that I understand what the...
So on the kind of the effect plot of the fragility kind of part. So I thought that makes a lot of sense. But so the reason we should be worried about is because it is deep fake. Well, I think we would be see something similar about the censure or kind of the other kind of attack toward the candidates, but because they attack us first, retribution is fine. Those kind of the similar thing would happen on the negative campaign strategy. That's what I thought. So maybe the takeaway from your paper is that because it is a deepfake, it is meaningful, or so why should we worry about it?
I think we should worry about it because it's misinformation. So this links back to Leah's comment previously about what can we learn from the negative campaigning literature. And I think initially people were concerned about negative campaigning, but now it's become normalized. But negative campaign doesn't necessarily mean false, synthetic information that's being spread about candidates. And an attack ad can have true content, but just, be quite nasty. What we feel one should be especially concerned about as deepfakes is that they're deceptive. And that can be normalized in the same way that negative campaigning could be normalized as one way of interpreting our results.
Someone hand in the back.
Raise your hands high so Leah can see you.
Hi, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. I try to make connect between Kylan's presentation and Michelle's. So so question to you in relation to his project. What made you decide to focus on pre-bunking versus debunking? Because I kind of think it's more like a debunking process. Do you see this as more effective? Because debunking seems like more effective in terms of implementation, it's easier. But this is more internalized kind of a measure. So what's your thoughts? Any reference that you use for?
So there is quite a large literature that I'm not as familiar as I ought to be because I'm not the resident psychologist on our project, but on pre-bunking and as it opposes to debunking. In general, you're totally right that debunking is much more direct. Part of the problem with debunking in general is that at least a lot of the debunking research that I've seen generally finds that because most people don't see any given debunk. So most people exposed to a piece of misinformation are just going to believe that piece of misinformation, even if the debunks are made like widely disseminated and made available. So our goal, the goal of pre-bunking in general, is to try and get out ahead of it, especially because if you can get this pretty weak, pretty small dose to people, it can be quite effective. And as we sort of are pointing towards it can be also effective at building some like the media literacy or just like the skepticism of potential misinformation that's out there. But I think they're complementary, and I thought Kylan did great work.
Can I add something to that? So, in terms of applicability to the election world, pre-banking is essentially voter education. So election officials communicate to voters about how things work, and hopefully that builds resilience and resistance, right? So that's the mechanism, and it should be, the election officials can speak to that maybe. It should be not a higher lift in that perspective, because rapid response and monitoring, having the tools, at least in this environment, is very difficult. So pre-banking in that respect should be something that is an important tool that election officials have.
Oh, actually, yeah. One minor thing on that point is we've had some really exciting conversations with some election officials as like misinformation or new pieces of misinformation have been coming out, and helping them like build pre-bunking doses or kind of figure out what to say. And so I think in part it's helpful for the election officials themselves just be able to get out ahead of it and see what's coming down the pipeline.
I was just going to say this was a fantastic panel. All 4 papers were fantastic, and I especially like the link between, well, they connected in lots of ways, but the NYU team paper and the Caltech, Washington University and St. Louis paper, because both of those were really quite a positive message that that there is lots of promise of these chat boxes. I was just going to say for the NYU paper, so. Right here, that your perplexity treatment was not statistically significant in believing you know what I'm talking about? And you talked about but it didn't decrease it as much as it should have, but it was non-significant. So once it's non-significant, we don't care about like where it is on that bar. And I think, I don't know, but if you had fewer treatments, and so you had larger N's in your treatment cells, could that help in the future? I always worry about that. That's my big thing. Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. One, just pushing back on if we don't care if it drops out of non-significant, we do still care, because the point estimate, even in the face of uncertainty, is our best guess of the effect. And there is a chance that if we had like quadrupled our sample size, we would see a statistically significant effect. So pushing back on that bit, but yeah, the effect remains that using this tool makes you like either it does nothing or it makes you slightly more likely to believe misinformation. Kind of the reason we think that that's a positive thing is it is about half as much as the Google treatment.
I would just say, for my take, your study was more positive than the words that you said about it.
Okay.
That's how I read your slides.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you. I realize that nobody wants more variables in anything, but have you thought about the impact of ranked choice voting on the downstream selections? So would there be a more durable punishment for a rank 2 or a rank 3 for somebody who is using a date fake? Could it be a deterrent?
Haven't thought about that possibility of how deepfakes would interact with electoral rules, and I now want to think about that and would love to talk to you during the break about it. Thanks.
Hi. So this is for Kylan and Mitchell. Sort of a broad question about alignment. So it strikes me that we're kind of in a best case scenario here. One is that we have like researcher oversight to make sure that our interventions are sort of to some extent doing what we want. And the other thing is that we have, broadly speaking, pretty well aligned AIs, right? So whatever chatbots we're using are either being prompt engineered into getting us favorable like misinformation treatments, or are just like not, the type of chatbots that are going to point voters to misinformation or have like distinctly partisan bends to them. But this is not always how voters are going to interact with chatbots, and this is not always how chatbots are going to be. And so broadly, I'm wondering if either of you have thoughts about the question of alignment in these misinformation treatments, and I guess a little bit more concretely, like, did you experiment with different platforms that might have different, even subtle political bents to them, or like, sort of a worst case scenario, like, are you using the ones that are explicitly designed to be partisan? And do we have a sense of whether those are helping or hurting, sort of as a more real world way that voters are interacting with these language models?
Great question. We should also probably talk after the break, because I think there's a lot that we have been thinking, at least internally, about this set of issues. Just very loosely, one thing that we've been thinking somewhat about is just like how to make this type of thing more persuasive, which like really gets to how houses work. And one way that we've thought about doing this is by employing some of these like biased chatbots, like with the thought of like, oh, well, if we train one to be extra biased in this particular way, maybe it will speak better to some subset of the electorate. At least for our work, I'm not, there's sort of this like implicit assumption that whoever's running a like pre-bunking style bot is going to at least be using an aligned AI. Where I would be really concerned is when people are doing their searches with their own personal AI, and I think Kylan can speak to that.
Yeah. So we did an experiment with like different models. In the initial phase, we did play around with which ones would work. But in the experiment, it is just Perplexity, and we just used how it is as anybody would access it. Our findings rest on the assumption that the people who develop these tools have alignment that resonates with pro-social outcomes. Like, we assume that Perplexity wants people to believe true things and not believe false things. I think with most models that is a correct assumption. No guarantees on how it looks moving forward. But I guess your point is valid. Like, we need to be thinking about what alignment is going into these models, and we need to have a way to actually understand it, because right now they do it behind the curtain, and we don't know, and we don't know when it changes.
Can I ask Mike a quick question? I have a question for you.
We have room for one more question.
Well, I've been informed that we could keep going for a couple more hours, a few more minutes. She wasn't taking the bait, but if we have a couple more questions, we could.
I'll keep it short. So I'm curious, interesting paper. I'm curious what you think the mechanism is. So I could imagine, and I might have missed it, but so maybe there's something in the study actually that could speak to this. But I could imagine where you imagine that you told them that this candidate ran a satirical deepfake, right? Or so you tried to separate out what the use of that deepfake was in this campaign, compared to, say, ran an intentionally misleading deepfake, or alternatively, you could say they knowingly ran an ad that lied about the other candidate, but without mentioning a deepfake, right? And so I'm curious, like, what you think, or if there's something in the data where you could kind of scale the sort of size of those effects. Like, is the mechanism actually that people really don't like it when candidates intentionally run ads that lie about their opposition, whether or not it's a deepfake, and then has nothing to do with the medium, or is there actually something particular about this particular medium that's sort of doing the work here?
Great questions. I would say the data that we collected aren't able to answer those questions, but those would be good ones for follow-up. The first one connects with Betsy's question about satire versus, intentionally trying to mislead voters about either the character or the policy of the candidates. That would be an interesting head-to-head comparison for a follow-up experiment. And likewise, running an experiment in which we compared an ad that lied but wasn't delivered in the form of a deepfake versus deepfake would help us say what's the added danger of a deepfake. Yep.
I think you had your hand up before, or no? So no, that's okay.
I have a question for Kylan's paper. It's very interesting, really nice research. My question is, I was thinking like a little bit about the mechanisms of like more search leads to stronger beliefs in this kind of mis or false information. Is it because they are repeatedly exposed to the same identical, like almost verbatim pieces of like lines of misinformation, or is it because they, through the search, they find some sort of supportive evidence from some other peripheral kind of news, or and how that interact with AI, like whether because AI gives less like verbatim kind of information, more supporting information, maybe is that one of the potential reasons for the difference?
Yeah, awesome question. As far as like other things we measured that predicted belief, one of the things that popped and was most consistently a predictor of if they'd believe it is if they said, I have seen this story before somewhere. And this lines up with what we're seeing a lot in like across different research projects, is that the number of exposures to a misinformation idea like really increases the likelihood of believing, like aside from like if it's more persuasive or if you spend more time with it, just the number of hits. And so that we think that's definitely something that's going on. Thinking about how Google functions, if it pops up 10 links and 2 of them just echo the same claim, that's potentially 2 more exposures. It could be the case that the way that Perplexity is answering the question is reducing the number of exposures to that claim. That definitely could be the thing. We also think that, you know, it has something to do with the summary. Usually it'll summarize the article. Usually it will try to say, hey, this is from a unreliable source. You should be cautious. Yeah.
Thanks. Well, and next year when we get together, I'll look forward to comparing the chatbots built on top of Deep Blue GPT and Truth GPT and see how those work out. Been a great panel. Thanks everybody for the questions and the presentation.